Next, we are going to hear from Christine Bohan. Christine is the deputy editor of The Journal, where she also runs the fact-checking project. She has produced the award-winning podcasts Stardust and The Explainer. She's previously worked for The Guardian and The Irish Times, and she occasionally lectures at Dublin City University. Christine is now going to give us a presentation about breaking the internet. Christine, over to you.
Yeah, slightly terrifying title there, but hopefully I can chat a bit about it. So hi everyone, and thanks very much for being here this evening. Aideen talked about the theme of 10 years in her intro there, which I think is kind of relevant for me, and it's how I kind of grounded my thoughts on this, because it's 10 years since I joined the Journal. I've been there for almost 10 years now. I guess we were all moving around a lot during the financial crisis and trying to figure out what we were doing, what our next steps were. But I found this a really good time just to be taking kind of the headspace to kind of think about, you know, how much things have changed in the past 10 years for news and, you know, everything online, and how much it's, I don't know, it's just been such a decade of transformation, I think, for the news, particularly the way that people consume the news. I think it's probably been maybe the most dramatic shift in the way people get their news that we've probably ever seen. But at the same time, I think that journalism has remained very constant throughout that. I think it's the environment around it that has changed, if that makes sense. Because journalism is still very much about picking up the phone. It's about asking questions. It's about, you know, trying to scoop everybody else, trying to break the news, trying to explain the news. And if you think about the biggest stories of the past decade, it's things like, you know, COVID, Brexit, Golfgate, repeal, marriage equality. And these are all stories that would involve the same skills that journalism always has, but it's the way that the stories have been shared after they've been written that's changed massively. And I think that's going to continue to evolve over the coming decade. It's about how do people actually get the stories to their news. We were chatting just before this began about, you know, being at weddings recently and getting news notifications on Apple Watches or whatever it is. Like, you can't escape the news in a way that you probably could, you know, even a decade ago. So it's about, like, what does that look like? Like, how does this evolve? So I just want to talk about how this has looked from the inside, like from an actual newsroom, from the perspective of someone working in online news, and just where that fits into kind of Ireland's digital heritage. So we are talking about the news here. And I think when I started at the Journal in 2011, there was a huge debate at the time about, was the internet going to ruin news, and whether you could actually do good journalism on the internet. And it did feel like there was this sense of maybe the internet will just go away and it will just be a fad or be a thing that doesn't, you know, last for too long or disrupt news too much. And the news should be left to newspapers or for radio or to television. And, you know, it feels silly even saying these things now. It feels quite quaint or quite kind of outdated when we see how the internet has actually fortified journalism and made it more robust and done things we probably never thought journalism could do. And you see that particularly, I think, in long form journalism and investigative journalism, like in multimedia. And in a lot of ways, I actually think we're in a golden age of journalism now. And I feel like we should be talking about that and recognizing that the internet hasn't broken journalism. It's actually made it better. It's made it much stronger. There have been bad things as well, which I will touch on. I'm not going to ignore the bad things the internet has done. But there's been a lot of studies in the US that have talked about how news now is much more, newsrooms are more enterprising, they're more analytical, they're more investigative than they've ever been. And I think that tallies with what we're seeing in Ireland too. So this is just kind of giving you like a typical day in the newsroom in the Journal now, which has been, you know, it's changed a little bit over the decade, not so much. The biggest difference is the photograph you can see there of all of us working from home at the moment. Sorry, not a few of us reporters on any given day, but you can see that, you know, the bedrock of what we do is like the stories, like, and get, you know, on a typical day, we might have like 50 stories, there might be a fact check, explainers, newsletters, and then the tweets, the Facebook posts, the things that distribute and get the stories out into the world. And I'd imagine this is very similar to almost any newsroom in the country, whether it's national or local. So a lot of the challenges to journalism haven't come from, you know, from the internet, despite all the fears that there were, but they've come from other areas. They've come from things like changing business models, distrust in the media, attacks on the freedom of the press. So I'm going to talk about some of these changes and focus on three main ones, which are social media, audience, and then the challenge of false news as well. So this is about how social media changed everything. Like when we talk about journalism changing over the last decade, a lot of the time we're actually talking about how social media changed everything and flipped things for journalism. Because at the start of the decade, I think social media almost felt like it was revolutionary, in the way that it was getting the news to people. It helped flip this whole idea that the news was like top down, that people would get their news from, the man reading the news at 6 o'clock every day on the television, or the newspaper you would buy on your commute on the way to work. Like it was this idea that the news could only be delivered at certain times in certain formats. And social media just said, no, that's not how it works at all. It actually reached people where they were. So I think one example of it is if you look at the number of people who liked Facebook posts for the biggest newsrooms in Ireland, there's over 2.5 million people have followed the pages like the Irish Times, the Independent, the Examiner, the Journal, and RTE altogether. Like there's a huge audience and appetite for this. And it's the same again for every newsroom in the country. You'll see them on Facebook, on Twitter. A lot of them are on Instagram. A few of the brave ones are on TikTok or Snapchat, messaging apps, the places where people are. They're going to where the people are getting everything else. So that's why they're going to be there to get their news to them too. And it made so much sense at the time because the internet was so democratizing and, it kicked out the old gatekeepers and it put the audience front and center. It let them choose where and when and how they would get their news. But a number of things have happened that have kind of soured the relationship, I think, between newsrooms and social media. So I kind of want to just touch on that a little bit about how it's not this kind of rosy in the garden relationship that it used to be. And I think the most dramatic change has been in the start of 2018, Facebook kind of ripped up the rule book and said it was going to deprioritize news. And it was instead going to show people news from friends and family rather than from news sites that they might follow. And for a lot of newsrooms, this was like turning off the tap for traffic for them. Because up until then, like many newsrooms have just been responding to the whims of Facebook. Like Facebook would say, right, we really want newsrooms to do video and we're going to show users video. And a lot of newsrooms, particularly in the US and the UK, but some in Ireland too, went, okay, cool, we will make more video because that is what Facebook wants and it will get to our audience and deliver some more traffic. And it was almost like every year Facebook would have something new and say, right, now we want you to do Facebook Lives, or now we want you to do something else. And a lot of newsrooms did jump when Facebook whistled. And it was kind of in retrospect, it probably wasn't the best decision for a lot of newsrooms to do this, because when Facebook flipped that switch and said, right, we're not going to show that much news to people anymore, it was like a turning point in the relationship between newsrooms and social media. I think for a lot of newsrooms, it was the first time they realized that social media platforms are competitors. They're not allies. And at the center of this, I think, is trust. And I think that that's the big kind of concept of the most important things for newsrooms at the moment. It's about this idea about trust, about being able to differentiate yourself by getting your audience to actually trust you and to trust the news that you're delivering. It's probably the most valuable commodity, I think, on the internet right now, especially given, the past 4 or 5 years, which have not been a great time on the internet, as you probably know if you've been on the internet at all. I think the idea that, any website can drum up traffic through social media, but its quality and its trustworthiness are the things that will get your readers to actually come back to you again and again. And I think as trust in the platforms themselves declined, as people started saying, actually, I don't really want to go to Facebook every day, or actually Twitter is a bit of a hellmouth, then suddenly newsrooms became less willing to kind of hitch their wagon to these platforms. And the platforms have been doing a lot to get people to use, to get news back front and center in their apps in the last couple of years. Like Google is putting a lot of money into Google News. Apple is doing the same with Apple News. Twitter's got Twitter Moments as a way to showcase big news stories. Facebook has tried to have a bit of a détente with the news industry. But I do think that the damage has been done. I think we're never going to see newsrooms going back to relying as much on social media as we did before. And instead, I think for a lot of newsrooms, the focus has been on getting readers and getting the audience to come directly to you, to cut out the middleman of social media. So, for us at the Journal, Facebook and Twitter brings in like very roughly 5% of our traffic every day. So it's not insignificant, but if it disappeared tomorrow, we would be okay. Like we would survive without them. And this is why you see a lot of newsrooms doing things focusing on things like podcasts, on newsletters, on live events, on push notifications, whether it's to your watch or to your phone or whatever it is, but all these things that actually just go straight to your audience and build that relationship with the audience, and you've more control over it in a way that I think Facebook always made it very difficult to do. And I think relying on Facebook in some ways rewarded kind of the worst elements of journalism, because it relied on, kind of clickbait headlines or kind of mawkish emotional stories. So now I think what's changed is that newsrooms are more likely to be looking at whether their traffic is coming from their apps, from Google, from WhatsApp, rather than from Facebook or from Twitter. So I see this as a good thing. Like I think it's a very good time to be in newsrooms, and hopefully for audiences too. I think that's the the thing, as long as the audiences are still, as long as readers are still getting good quality news that they trust from somewhere, whether it's like a journalist they like on Twitter, or whether it's a newsroom they like, or whatever it is, but just that people are getting good quality news. I will run through this bit very quickly. I'll go through this bit quickly because I'm aware of my time limits here. So this is just very quickly looking at how news websites looked 10 years ago in Ireland, and not hugely different to how they look today. Like if you look at them, you know, they look a lot cleaner nowadays, but the basics are there in terms of, you know, it's still about breaking news from Ireland and abroad. It's still kind of prioritizing breaking stories, explaining the news, breaking the news. But the single biggest difference is the way that people are getting their news now, because it used to be that people would go to desktop websites of news, the desktop sites for news websites, and now it's far more likely that people are getting the news through their smartphones. And this widespread use of smartphones has led to one of the biggest changes in journalism, which is the increasing involvement and the expectation of involvement from the readers. Like, and there's always been an element of this. Like you think about, say, people writing letters to the editor, for example, but the way that the internet became more active meant that readers became more like users. And we saw this change gaining momentum with citizen journalism too. So, you know, you get the photograph of the plane crashing into the Hudson, or you get mobile phone footage from the London bombings. And, you know, it could be seen in loads of smaller ways as well. You know, news websites started having comment sections for the first time. Or one of the first big news stories that we saw in Ireland involving Twitter, Simon Coveney tweeting about his thoughts on Brian Cowan doing an interview in Morning Ireland during the Fianna Fáil Ardèche back then. So this kind of placing front and center of readers was a big flip, you know, and I think in some ways we've actually seesawed back where readers aren't quite like it was an experiment to get readers more involved. And I think for a lot of newsrooms, they've kind of rode back on that in some ways and said that, you know what, that was worth doing, and it was worth kind of, again, part of the democratization of the internet. But in some ways, some of these things haven't worked out in the way that you might have thought. Like, say, comment sections aren't always the bastion of, you know, good debate and free speech that people may have expected or wanted. Citizen journalism has its place, but actually you do need, you know, proper, you know, professional journalists to parse the news and gatekeep the news in some ways. So, and then the final thing I just want to touch on very quickly is just about how the change with false news and the growth in misinformation and false news in Ireland, particularly over the last year and a half, because, you know, COVID has had just a massive impact on the amount of misinformation shared in Ireland. And I think we're kind of at a crossroads now in Ireland, because we had such a low level of misinformation in this country before COVID. It grew massively with COVID. And I think the big question now is, can Ireland go back to the way that we were before? Or is misinformation just something that we now have to live with in this country? And are we just like so many other countries? We're not special anymore. And kind of a spoiler, I do think it has changed everything. I don't think we are going to be able to go back to the way that things were, just because it's just exploded so much. We had always been quite different when it came to other countries with the levels of misinformation, because we had pockets of it, particularly around things like the water charges protests, the abortion referendum, but we never had like these big themes like they had in other countries, like say Brexit in the UK would be the obvious example, or Trump in the US, where it was like these magnets for misinformation. Ireland didn't really have those. We would have false news stories, like say a TD would stand up in the Dáil and talk about, you know, something dodgy. They would say something untrue or something almost untrue. So it was rarely orchestrated or rarely viral, the kind of things that you would think of when you think of false news like this, the kind of Pope Francis endorses Donald Trump for president, which is kind of a classic kind of the genre. Ireland just never really saw much of that. And so when we do fact checking at the Journal, we've done it since 2016. And a lot of times we'd be fact checking kind of almost wonky, kind of academic things that were kind of politely correcting the record. Like Leo Varadkar and Owen Murphy came out and said that Ireland has a low level of homelessness compared to other countries. And we were like, oh, let's check this. And it turns out you actually can't compare that. You know, there's no figures that let you make that kind of comparison. So we could fact check that, kind of correct the record, but it was always very polite and very kind of, yeah, I think quite academic or quite wonky. But then COVID happened, and like almost overnight, it was just like a switch was just flipped and everything just changed. And it became really clear that, you know, the amount of false stories grew, the places that they were being shared grew, and the number of platforms that were allowing false stories to be shared grew. And just to give you an idea of scale, like when COVID started first became a huge story in kind of January, February, March 2020, we set up a WhatsApp phone so people could forward us on false messages or messages that they thought might be fake, that they would like to see fact checked. And in the very first weekend we had that phone, we got over 800 messages sent in to us. And we knew that false stories were like an issue in Ireland, but that was the first time with the scale of this. This is huge. We really need to be concerned about this. This is something Ireland needs to be worried about. And it became really clear that despite all the buttresses that Ireland had, you know, like our balanced media or our lack of partisanship, none of that actually mattered. It helped to delay false news, but it wasn't a protection against it. So there was an audience of people who wanted to consume this. There were platforms that allowed them to do it. And that was it. That was all that was needed. So the amount of misinformation has kind of ebbed and flowed since then. It was huge at the start of the pandemic. It got quieter during last summer, but it's actually really, really high again at the moment due to the vaccines and kind of conversations around restrictions. And it's pulling in misinformation from other countries too. And I think that this misinformation speaks to a lot about the current situation about news online, just because, you know, it's about the need for regulation of the social media platforms. It's about the debate around where free speech begins and ends, and, you know, what are the limits around that. And also just whether news organizations should amplify claims made by bad faith actors, or whether they need to just be ignoring them, which is a constant discussion that we have in the newsroom. So that's kind of a whistle-stop tour around some of the changes in the newsrooms in the past few years. And I think that hopefully, I think what comes across from this is that there's always going to be like a place for strong, original, investigative, good reporting in Ireland. And I think that that has actually become much stronger and much, you know, healthier, I think, over the past decade. And I think what has changed is the way that people are consuming the stories. So readers may have changed the way that they get their news, but they still want to get this trustworthy news, even if it's not necessarily from Facebook or from the other platforms. So that's me. Sorry, I went slightly over my time there, but hopefully that was some use. So I'll hand it back over to Aideen now.